So today we're going to talk about assessment and ethics in the context of NCIS Season 8, Episode 14, A Man Walks into a Bar. In this episode, Dr. Rachel Cranston comes to NCIS to do psychological evaluations on Gibbs' team. Alright, let's get started. So let's first begin with what is an assessment. Why would you assess someone? So an assessment is a battery of tests or a battery of variables, if you will, that a therapist or perhaps psychiatrist or psychologist might collect to determine whether someone has a disorder. In particular, the most common measures used are case histories about someone's past, an interview with the patient, medical background, formal tests, informal observations, and also criterion tests or dynamic assessments. So I think most people are familiar with case histories, interviews, and medical backgrounds. So let's talk a bit more about formal tests, informal observations, and criterion tests and dynamic assessments. So formal tests are, as you can expect, they're standardized tests, which means that they've been standardized and they're given the same way with the same instructions. So no matter who gives the test, the instructions are always going to be the same and it's always given in the same manner. And it's like taking the state tests, like those annoying tests that you have to take in school where you fill in the bubbles. That's a formal test. It's standardized and all the students have to take the test in the same way. It's also kind of a pain in the butt for both the people who give the test and also the test takers. I don't think anyone really likes formal tests, but they can be useful. The most common formal test you might see in a psychological evaluation is an IQ test. If you've never done an IQ test before, they basically ask you to memorize some numbers and repeat them both forwards and backwards. They ask you definitions of words. They also ask you to build shapes out of blocks based on the picture that they give you. And sometimes you have to identify which one is different, which one is same, and how you have to choose a picture that completes a pattern. And they don't just test you on whether it's right and wrong, they also test you on speed. But none of that is relevant because we're not evaluating IQs today. So moving on to informal observations. In informal observations, clinicians are not supposed to interact with their clients. They're just supposed to observe the clients. Usually this is done in a natural environment. And in natural, we mean an environment in which daily activities take place. So it might be watching a child in a classroom to observe how they interact with their peers. That would be an informal observation. And finally, criterion tests and dynamic assessments they measure how well you can do a certain activity. So one example of this might be going to a shooting range and having an officer pass a shooting test to make sure they actually know how to use their gun and use it safely. I'm not sure officers pass that test. They probably have to curve it because officers miss the target. Or they hit the wrong target. Bad guys have a large curve on the shooting test. Let's just say that. Okay, so then the next question is, why would someone do an assessment? As mentioned before, an assessment is typically done to determine if someone has a disorder or could benefit from services. In this particular case, Dr. Cranston comes to NCIS to assess Gibbs' team to make sure that they're fit for duty. So I tried to look up what fit for duty meant, and it's really rather vague, or at least it was vague in the book that I read on ethics. It basically said that if someone is working for the federal government, the government does have the right to assess someone's health records concerning their mental health, but what has to absolutely be reported is pretty vague. I think in this case, they would be checking for PTSD, depression, suicidal behaviors, or to make sure that someone will not abandon their post or use deadly force. Yeah, deadly force, gotta work on that one. So in this episode, throughout the episode, we see Dr. Cranston use background checks, interviews, and behavioral observations. They don't show her checking backgrounds, but based on what she tells the agents, I believe she checked their background records. Dr. Cranston only did one interview with an agent, and that agent was Agent David. So in interviews, you typically want to use open-ended questions to let the patients guide the interview. This is because we want our care to be patient-centered. We want to make sure we're doing what our patients value and need. Like if your patient doesn't need help walking and is happy to use a wheelchair, then you know what? Don't focus on walking. That's done. An example of an open-ended question was when Dr. Cranston asked Agent David, "What is the thing you're looking for?" I think Dr. Cranston said it in a rude way, and it was sort of like, "Why are you here?" And I feel like her questions put Ziva on edge and didn't allow Ziva to be open and vulnerable with Dr. Cranston, which kind of defeats the purpose of an interview. Again, you want the patient to tell you what they need. You want to know, why are they here for treatment? Why are they seeking your services? What's most important to them? That's what you want to find out in an interview. You want to find out their challenges and their weaknesses, but you also want to find out what they want to be able to do. You want to typically avoid close-ended questions or suggestive questions. An example of a suggestive statement or question would be when Dr. Cranston says, "It must be invigorating to be investigating without Agent Nozo." I feel like that was not appropriate in this case because she was telling him how he was supposed to feel about not working with Agent Nozo. It just seemed inappropriate to suggest how he should feel instead of Agent McGee telling her how he feels. Also, just want to say, it just seemed really inappropriate when she started talking about relationships with Agent McGee. She was there to judge his fitness for the job and not interrogate his life. So I really wondered what her goal was and why was she really assessing those agents? Because why are you going into his personal life? On one hand, therapists have to ask about the patient's personal lives because they can tell you how the disorder started and help you understand what's important to them by asking about their daily activities. But I also feel like she should have asked what's most important to you rather than suggesting that he should be in a committed relationship. It's really none of her business that McGee is not in a relationship if his singleness doesn't affect his job performance. If his relationship did affect his job performance, then it would make sense to ask about it, but there's no evidence for that. McGee seems fine as a single man. It's fine. Moving on. My biggest problem with Dr. Cranston is that she seems to be guiding the interview rather than letting the patient do the talking. In fact, she seems like a mind reader, which is odd to me. For example, when she mentions Kate to Agent Nozo after he has his flashbacks in the morgue, it seemed like she was reading his mind. No therapist can read your mind. It's impossible. Unless you have some kind of superpower that makes you able to read minds, and even then you'd probably want to cut it off quick. Because there's probably a lot of nonsense that goes on in people's heads. When I was younger and I thought people could read minds, I used to always think of a dancing T-Rex if I was thinking about something inappropriate. I was like, no, I can't let anyone know I'm thinking about that. I have to think of a dancing T-Rex to throw them off my trail. Yeah, there you go. Psychologists can't read minds. It's why they frequently come to the wrong conclusion. Like if you ever talk to a psychologist and you talk about how like this one bad thing happens, they might think, oh, you must hate your roommate. No, I don't hate my roommate. I just want them to stop putting dirty dishes in the bathroom sink. Things like that. They can't read your mind. So let's move on from interviews and move on to behavioral observations. So in behavioral observations, you have lots of things to consider. For example, the environment can impact an assessment. If you're in a noisy classroom, it might be difficult to hear what the children are talking about. It can be hard to concentrate, and your attention might be torn in different directions. In this case, Dr. Cranston goes out in the field to do informal observations or behavioral observations is because she tells Director Vance that Gibbs's team has pushed off their evaluations for so long that they need to be done now, and they don't have a choice. So to prevent them from stalling some more, she accompanies them into the field. Besides the environment impacting behavioral observations, the therapists themselves can impact somebody's behavior. I think we have to remember when authority figures are around, people act differently. They're more likely to obey commands and follow orders. An example of this is the famous Milgram study, where authority figures basically told someone to shock a participant if they got an answer wrong. And people did. They shocked the participants when they got answers wrong. The shocks were fake, by the way. That's not the point. The point is they obeyed authority and they went against their morals. They basically acted differently when they were around a professional. You have to take that into account when doing behavioral observations. The person might be on their best behavior in the field because you're around. Finally, I'd like to talk about Dr. Cranston's role in her relationships to Gibbs's team. We had lots of evidence that she was here for something else, besides just evaluating their psyches and their minds. She was using suggestive statements. She was talking about Kate. Why? Why was she talking about things that were not really that important to the current evaluation? And the reason later becomes clear when Gibbs covers her with a blanket in the staff room. We learn that Dr. Cranston is Kate's sister, and that she had actually done the evaluations because she wanted to be close to Kate. She wanted to find closure. And since Gibbs's team had been there when Kate died, she thought maybe she could learn something from those people about Kate's last moments. And this is a problem, since professionals are highly discouraged from treating their family. And that might be because they'll say things to please family members rather than do evidence-based practice. You have mixed roles when you're treating family or someone you're close to, like a friend or a neighbor. You might just want to make them happy rather than admit that they have a problem, and your objectivity is compromised, your competence isn't that great, and your effectiveness just goes down. So it's just better to avoid evaluating and treating your family, especially if that person holds some kind of influence or advantage over you. So after you've done an assessment, you have to write it all up in a report. This report integrates results from multiple tests, from the clinic interviews, medical histories, behavioral observations, and any and every other important piece of information that you think is relevant to the diagnosis of client. And when Director Vance reads her report at the very end of the episode, it makes no sense. There are no clinical terms, no final prognoses, no reviews of information or data that she collected during the session. She says that they're a wreck, but there's no evidence to support that. She didn't do any formal tests or any screeners to determine if the agents had a clinical diagnosis. She did do some interviews and some observations, but they were highly suggestive and compromised because of her relationship with Kate. So I don't think her report has any merit at all. I think Dr. Cranston is very empathetic, and she'd probably be good in therapy, good at helping people sort out their feelings, but I don't think she's very good at diagnosing people, and I think she can work on her assessment skills. Alright, that's it for this one. See you next time. Bye!